The marble floor of the Mancini Grande Hotel gleamed like black glass. Angela Jackson's hands trembled as she balanced the floral cake boxes, their corners pressing into her palms hard enough to leave red marks. 3 months. She'd been making deliveries to this hotel for 3 months now, always through the service entrance, always invisible, always safe. Today, a maintenance issue had forced her through the main lobby. Of course. Because fate apparently had a cruel sense of humor, and her life wasn't already complicated enough without walking through a space where Marcus might spot her. The lobby stretched before her like an impossible distance, all vaulted ceilings and crystal chandeliers that scattered light like diamonds. Her worn sneakers squeaked against that perfect floor, each sound announcing her presence, marking her as someone who didn't belong. She kept her head down, dark curls falling forward to shield her face. 34 steps to the elevator bank. Then she could disappear into the service corridors, deliver her cakes, and vanish back into the safety of anonymity. 27 steps left. Angela! The voice sliced through the elegant murmur of the lobby like breaking glass. Her stomach dropped. That voice, smooth and reasonable on the surface, with that underlying edge that turned her blood to ice water. Angela, wait! I know that's you. She didn't turn around. Maybe if she kept walking, he'd think he was mistaken. 20 steps to the elevators. Just 20 more steps. Don't you dare ignore me! His hand clamped onto her shoulder, spinning her around with enough force that she nearly dropped the carefully balanced boxes. Marcus Reynolds stood before her, looking exactly as he had 6 months ago when she finally found the courage to leave. Sandy brown hair perfectly styled, pale blue eyes that once seemed warm now cold and calculating. I need to make my delivery, Angela said, proud when her voice emerged steadier than she felt. Please let me go. Let you go? His laugh was sharp, bitter. Like you let me go? Just vanished one day, blocked my number. We were supposed to build a life together, Angela. His hand shot out, gripping her wrist. Not hard enough to bruise, Marcus was too smart for that, but firm enough to communicate that she wasn't leaving until he decided to let her go. The realization galvanized something inside her, that small, fierce part that had found the courage to leave in the first place. She twisted sharply, using the move her friend Keisha had taught her. Her wrist slipped from his grip, and she ran. The elevator doors were closing. 20 feet. 15. Behind her, Marcus's shout echoed through the lobby. You can't just run from me! 5 feet. Angela threw her hand forward, fingers catching the edge of the closing doors. They slid open, and she stumbled inside, gasping with desperate relief. She was safe. She'd made it. She was. Angela looked up, and the breath caught in her throat. The elevator wasn't empty. A man stood in the far corner, and everything about him radiated danger. Tall, powerfully built, wearing an immaculately tailored charcoal suit. But it was his eyes that froze her in place, dark, almost black, fixed on her with the unwavering intensity of a predator. Antonio Mancini. Owner of this hotel. Owner of half the luxury properties in the city. And according to whispered conversations, a man with connections that extended deep into the shadows. The most dangerous man in New York City. And she just trapped herself alone with him. Before we continue, these stories take time to create, and subscribing is the simplest way to support the channel. If you enjoy intense, cinematic stories like this, hit like, share, and subscribe. And drop a comment, tell me where you're watching from. I read every comment. The weight of the cake boxes seemed to triple in Angela's arms as Antonio Mancini's gaze swept over her, assessing, calculating, missing nothing. 6 months of running from Marcus, 3 months of his escalating concern, that had morphed into something darker, 2 weeks of him showing up at every delivery location she'd scheduled. And now this. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, the vibration like a wasp against her hip. She didn't need to check it. She knew it was him. Another message in the endless stream that had started the moment she'd blocked his number, and he'd simply gotten a new one. The cakes in her arms represented 2 weeks of ingredient costs, $400 she absolutely could not afford to lose. Organic vanilla from Madagascar. Belgian chocolate. Edible flowers she'd driven to 3 different specialty shops to find. Each cake was a tiny masterpiece, the kind her mother used to create when Angela was small enough to stand on a step stool beside the kitchen counter, watching flour dust the air like snow. Those memories were what kept her going, the dream of building something of her own, something Marcus couldn't touch or control or take credit for during his father's dinner parties. The service elevator had been her lifeline, her invisible passage through this world of wealth where she delivered beauty but never belonged. Today, the yellow maintenance tape across its doors had felt like a betrayal. She'd stood there for 3 full minutes, weighing her options, knowing the main lobby meant exposure but thinking, hoping, that maybe Marcus wouldn't be here today. That maybe the universe would give her this one small mercy. Then she'd seen him through the revolving doors, that determined set to his shoulders she knew too well, and her heart had dropped into her stomach. Her phone had buzzed then too. "I saw you go in, Angela. We need to talk. I'm not leaving until we do." The words had made her skin crawl, made her feel like prey being herded into a corner. So she'd counted steps instead, the way her therapist taught her. 34 steps to safety. To the elevators. To escape. She'd made it to 27 before Marcus's voice had shattered her fragile composure, before his hand on her shoulder had reminded her body what it meant to be caught. But she'd broken free. She'd run. She'd reached the elevator, and for one perfect moment she'd thought she was safe. Antonio Mancini shifted slightly, a minute movement that somehow made him seem larger, more imposing in the confined space. His dark eyes hadn't left her face, and Angela realized with a sinking sensation that she jumped from the frying pan straight into the fire. Behind her, through the slowly closing doors, she could hear Marcus's approaching footsteps, his voice cutting through the lobby's elegant murmur. The doors sealed shut with a whisper of finality, and Angela stood frozen between the man she'd escaped and the one whose reputation made grown men nervous. Her mother's voice echoed in her memory. "Sugar and flour can't fix everything, baby girl, but they're a good place to start." Right now, Angela would have traded every cake in her arms for a way out of this elevator. But before those doors had closed, before she'd found herself trapped in this steel box with Antonio Mancini, there had been Marcus. Always Marcus. His footsteps had echoed across the marble lobby, that purposeful stride she'd once found confident now revealing itself as relentless. He'd caught up to her near the fountain, close enough that she could smell his overwrought cologne, see the practiced concern arranged on his features like a mask. "Baby, why are you running?" His voice had carried across the space, pitched perfectly for the audience of wealthy hotel guests and attentive staff. Reasonable. Hurt. Confused. "I just want to talk." "You're being irrational." He'd reached for her arm, fingers extended in what would look to observers like a gentle, caring gesture. Angela had jerked back hard enough that the cake boxes lurched sideways, the carefully constructed tiers shifting dangerously inside their packaging. Her heart had hammered against her ribs as she'd watched his expression flicker, just for a second, with something cold and angry before the mask of concern slid back into place. Hotel security had glanced their way from their position near the concierge desk. 2 men in crisp uniforms, one with his hand drifting toward his radio. Angela's hope had sparked, bright and desperate. Help. Finally, someone would see what was happening, would intervene, would make Marcus leave. But then they'd looked at Marcus, his expensive suit, his clean-cut appearance, his wounded boyfriend expression, and then at her. Wild-eyed, flour still dusting her hair, wearing her worn jeans and the t-shirt with a small stain from this morning's frosting mishap. Their eyes had said everything. She was the problem here. She was the one causing a scene. The security guards had looked away, dismissing the situation as a domestic dispute not worth their time. It was her worst nightmare playing out in real time. Marcus controlling the narrative even here, in this public space, making her look unstable while he appeared perfectly reasonable. She'd felt the familiar trap closing around her, the walls of his manipulation pressing in from all sides. Angela. His voice had dropped lower, meant only for her ears now, and the threat in it had been unmistakable. Stop making a scene. People are staring. You're embarrassing yourself. That's when she'd seen it, her opening. An elevator 30 feet away, its brass doors beginning their slow slide closed. Without thinking, without planning, Angela had bolted. Her sneakers had found purchase on the polished marble as Marcus's shout had erupted behind her. Angela, stop this! You're embarrassing yourself! She'd sprinted across that lobby like her life depended on it, cake boxes clutched against her chest, her breath coming in gasps. Wealthy patrons had turned to watch the commotion, a woman in a fur coat pausing mid-conversation, a businessman looking up from his phone, a couple with designer shopping bags stepping aside as she'd careened past. Their faces had blurred together in Angela's peripheral vision, all judgment and curiosity and discomfort at witnessing someone else's drama. 20 feet. 15. Marcus's footsteps had pounded behind her, closer than she'd expected. He'd always been fast, athletic in a way he'd been proud of, and the distance between them had been shrinking. The elevator doors had continued their inexorable journey toward each other, the gap narrowing with each desperate step she'd taken. 10 feet. 5. Angela's hand had shot out, fingers catching the edge of the closing doors just as they'd been about to seal shut. The sensor had triggered, and they'd slid open again with that soft mechanical whisper that had sounded like salvation. She'd thrown herself inside, stumbling, gasping, the cake boxes nearly tumbling from her grip as she'd caught herself against the elevator's back wall. Safe. She'd made it. She was finally safe. Then she'd looked up, and her breath had caught in her throat for an entirely different reason. Angela's heart hammered so hard she could feel it in her throat, in her fingertips, in the pulse points at her wrists where the cake box corners pressed into her skin. The elevator wasn't empty. She'd been so focused on escape, so desperate to put distance between herself and Marcus, that she hadn't even looked before throwing herself inside. Now she stood frozen, her back against the cool metal wall, staring at the man who occupied the far corner like he owned it, which, she realized with a sinking dread, he probably did. Antonio Mancini. She recognized him from the news articles she'd glimpsed on her phone, from the hushed conversations that rippled through the hotel staff whenever his name was mentioned. The kitchen workers fell silent when he passed. The concierge stood straighter. Even the general manager, a woman who commanded respect with a single glance, became deferential in his presence. He was tall, well over 6 feet, and powerfully built in a way that expensive tailoring couldn't quite disguise. The charcoal suit he wore fit him like it had been made specifically for his body, which it probably had, the fabric draping perfectly across shoulders that suggested real strength rather than mere gym vanity. Dark hair was slicked back from a face that looked like it had been carved from marble by an artist who understood that beauty and danger weren't mutually exclusive. Sharp cheekbones. A strong jaw shadowed with deliberate stubble. A mouth that might have been sensual if it wasn't currently set in a hard, unreadable line. But it was his eyes that froze her completely. Dark, almost black in the elevator's harsh lighting, and currently fixed on her with the unwavering focus of a predator who just noticed something unexpected in his territory. They were penetrating eyes, the kind that seemed to see through layers of pretense and fear straight down to whatever truth you were trying to hide. They catalogued every detail: her trembling hands, her flour-dusted hair, the cake boxes clutched against her chest like a shield, the wild panic that must be written all over her face. Angela's gaze dropped involuntarily, unable to hold that intense stare, and that's when she noticed his wrists. Tattoos peeked out from beneath his crisp white shirt cuffs, dark ink partially concealed by expensive gold cufflinks that probably cost more than her rent. She couldn't make out the full design, but she'd heard enough whispered stories to know what those marks meant. They weren't the casual tattoos of someone trying to look dangerous. They were earned. They were real. They marked him as exactly who she feared he was. The air in the elevator felt suddenly thick, pressing against her chest until breathing became a conscious effort. She'd escaped Marcus, jumped from the frying pan straight into the fire. This man, this dangerous, powerful man whose very presence made grown men nervous, was now trapped in this small metal box with her. The space that had seemed like salvation 30 seconds ago now felt like a cage. Antonio Mancini didn't move. Didn't speak. Just stood there in his corner, one hand holding his phone at his side, watching her with those unreadable dark eyes. The silence stretched between them, heavy and electric, punctuated only by the soft mechanical hum of the elevator and Angela's ragged breathing. She pressed harder against the back wall, trying to make herself smaller, less noticeable, as if she could somehow disappear into the polished metal. His gaze never wavered. Not when she shifted the cake boxes. Not when she drew in a shaky breath. Not when her eyes darted toward the floor numbers above the door, desperate for this ride to end, for any escape from this suffocating tension. The elevator doors began their slow slide closed, those brass panels moving toward each other with mechanical precision that suddenly seemed too slow, too deliberate. Safety was a closing gap away. Just a few more seconds and she'd be sealed inside with Antonio Mancini, but at least she'd be away from Marcus. At least she'd be moving, going somewhere, anywhere, but... A hand shot between the closing doors. The elevator jerked, the sensor triggering, and the doors reversed their movement with a soft pneumatic hiss. Angela's stomach plummeted as those brass panels slid open again, revealing Marcus standing in the gap, his chest heaving from the chase, his pale blue eyes blazing with fury barely contained beneath a veneer of wounded concern. His gaze locked on her first, accusatory, possessive, then shifted past her shoulder to Antonio Mancini. For one frozen moment, the three of them formed a tableau, Angela pressed against the back wall, Antonio Mancini still as stone in his corner, and Marcus framed in the doorway with his hand holding the elevator doors open. Marcus's expression flickered, confusion, then recognition, then something that might have been uncertainty, before his mask of reasonable concern slid back into place. But his hand didn't leave the door. His body didn't move from the threshold. And Angela realized with a terrible, sinking certainty that this nightmare was only just beginning. "Angela, get out here now." Marcus's voice carried that false reasonableness that made Angela's skin crawl, the tone he used when they were in public and he needed to appear like the rational one. Like she was the problem. Like he was simply a concerned boyfriend trying to help his irrational girlfriend see sense. She'd heard that voice so many times, at restaurants when she disagreed with him, at his father's dinner parties when she'd said something he deemed inappropriate, in their apartment when he'd cornered her with his constructive criticism about everything she did wrong. "You're making a scene," he continued, one hand still holding the elevator door open, his body angled to block her exit as if she might try to bolt past him. "Just come talk to me for 5 minutes. That's all I'm asking. 5 minutes of your time after 18 months together. Is that really so unreasonable?" His pale blue eyes flicked toward Antonio with dismissive irritation, the way someone might glance at an inconvenient obstacle, a piece of furniture in the wrong place, a stranger who'd accidentally wandered into a private conversation. Marcus clearly didn't recognize him. Didn't know who he was looking at. Didn't understand that the man in the expensive suit wasn't just some random hotel guest who'd been unfortunate enough to share an elevator with his fleeing ex-girlfriend. Angela felt the shift before she saw it. The air in the elevator grew colder, heavier, like the atmospheric pressure had dropped before a storm. Antonio Mancini's expression didn't change, his face remained that same carved marble, beautiful and hard and utterly unreadable. But something in his stillness became more pronounced, more deliberate. The kind of stillness that predators adopted right before they struck. Without a word, without asking permission, without even glancing back at her, Antonio stepped forward. His broad shoulders filled Angela's vision as he placed himself between her and the door. Between her and Marcus. A solid wall of expensive suit and controlled power, blocking Marcus's line of sight, cutting off his access to her as completely as if he'd slammed a steel barrier between them. He was broader than Marcus, she realized. Taller by several inches. Where Marcus was lean and athletic in that deliberate, gym-maintained way, Antonio was powerfully built, the kind of strength that came from something real, something earned rather than cultivated for appearance. He carried himself with the casual confidence of someone who never doubted his ability to dominate any space he entered, to control any situation he found himself in. "The lady doesn't want to talk to you." Antonio's voice was low and calm, almost conversational, with the barest hint of an Italian accent threading through his words like dark silk. But there was something underneath that calm, something cold and immovable that made the temperature in the elevator drop another few degrees. "Step back." It wasn't a request. It was a statement of fact, a prediction of what would happen next, delivered with the absolute certainty of someone who never been disobeyed. Marcus's face flushed red, color creeping up his neck and into his cheeks the way it always did when someone challenged his authority. "This is none of your business," he said, his voice rising slightly, the reasonable facade cracking at the edges. "Angela is my girlfriend. Ex-girlfriend." The words slipped out before Angela could stop it, barely more than a whisper, but it felt like a shout in the confined space. She stood behind Antonio's broad back, her hands still clutching the cake boxes, and found courage in his solid presence. In the way he positioned himself without hesitation. In the quiet authority that radiated from him like heat. "Ex-girlfriend," she repeated, stronger this time. Marcus's eyes tried to find her around Antonio's shoulder, but the other man shifted slightly, keeping himself between them with the precision of someone who understood exactly what he was doing. "She's not your anything," Antonio continued, his tone never rising but somehow becoming more menacing, like ice cracking under weight. Each word was measured, deliberate, carrying the weight of absolute certainty. "And you're going to leave? Now. You don't know what you're talking about," Marcus said, his voice tight with barely controlled anger. His hand pressed harder against the elevator door, his knuckles white. "Angela and I have history. We have things to work out. This is between us, and I'm not leaving until we have a proper conversation." He took a half step forward, trying to assert dominance, trying to push past this stranger who dared to interfere. "So why don't you mind your own business and let me talk to my—" The air in the elevator grew so cold Angela could almost see her breath. Antonio Mancini didn't move back. Didn't give an inch. His dark eyes fixed on Marcus with the kind of stare that Angela imagined could make grown men reconsider their life choices. And Marcus, finally, seemed to realize he'd miscalculated something fundamental about this situation. Marcus didn't recognize the danger he was in. Angela could see it in the way he held himself, in the self-righteous indignation that pulled his shoulders back and lifted his chin. He was used to being the smartest person in the room, the one with connections, the one whose father's name opened doors and closed mouths. He'd built his entire identity around that sense of untouchable privilege. "Look, buddy, I don't know who you think you are. I'm Antonio Mancini." The name landed like a physical blow. Angela watched. Everyone in the lobby who was paying attention watched, as the color drained from Marcus's face in a slow, terrible wave. His hand, which had been pressed so firmly against the elevator door, dropped to his side as if the muscles had simply stopped working. His mouth opened, closed, opened again without sound. She'd never seen Marcus speechless before. Had never seen that particular expression on his face, the dawning horror of someone who just realized they'd stepped off a cliff in the dark. "And I know exactly who you are, Marcus Reynolds." Antonio's voice remained that same low, calm register, but now each word carried weight, significance, the kind of information that shouldn't be casually known. "I know where you work, Reynolds and Associates, 42nd floor of the Morrison Building. I know your father is Richard Reynolds' senior partner." He paused, letting those details sink in, letting Marcus understand that this wasn't guesswork or lucky assumptions. "I know you've been harassing Miss Jackson for 3 months. Showing up at her workplace. Following her to client locations." Another pause, heavier than the last. "Sending 47 texts in a single day." 47. Angela's stomach lurched. She'd stopped counting after the first dozen that morning, had stopped reading them entirely after the first few. But Antonio knew. Had counted them. had been watching. Marcus's face had gone from pale to gray, his eyes widening with each specific detail that Antonio laid out like evidence in a court case. This wasn't a random encounter. This wasn't a stranger white knighting for a woman in distress. This was something else entirely, something calculated, informed, and deliberate. Antonio Mancini had information. Had resources. Had power that extended into places Marcus was only now beginning to comprehend. Here's what's going to happen. Antonio's voice dropped barely above a whisper, so quiet that Marcus had to lean forward to hear, had to move closer to the very man he should have been running from. The lobby around them had gone silent. Or maybe it was just that Angela's entire world had narrowed to this moment, to these words being delivered with the finality of a judge's sentence. You're going to leave this hotel. You're going to delete Angela's number from your phone. You're going to delete her email, her social media, every single point of contact you have. You're going to forget she exists. Each instruction was delivered with the same measured calm, the same absolute certainty. Because if I see you within 500 feet of her again, if I hear that you've contacted her, followed her, or so much as mentioned her name to anyone, I won't call the police. He paused, and in that pause, Angela felt the temperature drop another degree. Antonio's dark eyes bored into Marcus with an intensity that was almost physical. I'll handle it personally. The words hung in the air between them, heavy with implication, with threat, with the kind of promise that didn't need elaboration. Marcus's face had gone from gray to white, a sheen of sweat visible on his forehead despite the hotel's air conditioning. And trust me, Marcus, Antonio continued, his voice still that same devastating whisper. You don't want me handling things personally. Ask your father about the Castellano deal if you need clarification on what happens when someone becomes my problem. The Castellano deal. Angela saw the recognition flash across Marcus's face, saw the exact moment that whatever remaining defiance or dignity he'd been clinging to simply evaporated. His father would know that name, would know what had happened. And apparently it was enough to turn Marcus's blood to ice water. Marcus's voice cracked. He swallowed hard, tried again. I didn't, I was just. You have 5 seconds to leave my sight, Antonio said, no longer whispering. 5. 4. Marcus stumbled backward, nearly tripping over his own feet in his haste to put distance between himself and Antonio Mancini. I'm sorry, he stammered, the words tumbling out in a desperate rush. I'm sorry, I didn't know, I didn't realize, I'll leave her alone, I swear I'll. 3. Marcus turned and ran. Actually ran across that polished marble lobby, his expensive shoes slipping slightly as he fled toward the revolving doors. Wealthy patrons stepped aside, their expressions ranging from confusion to carefully concealed amusement. The security guards who dismissed Angela's distress earlier watched with neutral faces as Marcus Reynolds, son of Richard Reynolds, bolted from the Mancini Grande Hotel like the devil himself was on his heels. The elevator doors finally slid closed with a soft whisper of finality, sealing Angela alone with the man who'd just dismantled her nightmare with nothing more than words and the terrible weight of his reputation. The elevator doors closed with that same soft whisper, sealing Angela alone with Antonio Mancini once more. But everything felt different now. The air wasn't heavy with threat anymore, or at least, not threat directed at her. The silence that stretched between them as the elevator resumed its ascent felt charged with something else entirely, something Angela couldn't quite name through the adrenaline still flooding her system. Her hands trembled on the cake boxes, from relief, from the aftermath of terror, from the surreal unreality of what had just happened. Marcus was gone. Marcus, who'd been haunting her for 3 months, who'd made every delivery a calculated risk, who'd turned her own workplace into a minefield of anxiety, had just been dismantled and sent running by a man who'd barely raised his voice. She should thank him. She should say something, anything, to acknowledge what he'd just done for her. But her voice had abandoned her completely, trapped somewhere behind the tightness in her throat. Breathe. Antonio's voice was quiet, gentler than she'd expected from a man who'd just threatened Marcus Reynolds with casual, terrifying certainty. He reached out and pressed a button on the elevator panel, the emergency stop. The elevator glided to a smooth halt between floors, the sudden stillness making Angela acutely aware of how small this space was, how alone they were. "You're safe now," he continued, those dark eyes fixed on her with an intensity that was somehow less predatory than before, more assessing. Concerned even. "He won't bother you again." "How did you know?" The words emerged shaky, barely more than a whisper. Angela clutched the cake boxes tighter, needing something solid to anchor herself. "About Marcus. About what he's been doing. I pay attention to what happens in my hotel." Antonio's response was matter-of-fact, as if having comprehensive intelligence on harassment patterns was simply good business practice. "Security flagged him loitering near the service areas 3 times this week. I had someone look into why." He tilted his head slightly, studying her with those penetrating eyes that seemed to see everything she was trying to hide. "Angela Jackson, 26 years old. Owner of Sweet Angela's Pastries. You deliver to my hotel twice a month." He paused, and something that might have been approval flickered across his carved features. "Your work is exceptional." The compliment caught her completely off guard. In the past 3 months, every interaction with a man had been colored by fear or manipulation or control. Compliments from Marcus had always come with conditions, with expectations, with the implicit understanding that she owed him something in return. But Antonio's words carried no such weight. They were simply stated fact, delivered with the same certainty he'd used to dismantle Marcus's world. "You've..." Angela swallowed hard, trying to find her voice. "You've tried my desserts? The lemon lavender cake last month for the Morrison acquisition dinner. The chocolate torte with espresso buttercream for the Castellano meeting." He said it like he remembered every detail, like her creations had made an impression worth noting. "You have remarkable talent, Miss Jackson." The specific mentions made her breath catch. Those had been 2 of her most challenging orders: complex flavor profiles, delicate decorations, the kind of work that took hours of concentration and pushed her skills to their limits. She'd spent 3 days perfecting the lavender infusion, had gone through 4 batches of buttercream before achieving the exact espresso balance she'd wanted. And he noticed. Actually noticed, not just consumed them as background decoration for important business meetings. "And you're wasting it." The words cut through her momentary warmth like cold water. Angela's eyes snapped up to meet his, confusion and defensiveness warring in her chest. Antonio's expression remained neutral, but his voice carried an edge of something that sounded almost like frustration. "Running from men like him. Looking over your shoulder every time you make a delivery. Taking the service entrance to avoid being seen. Limiting yourself to small orders because you're afraid to grow your business, afraid that visibility means vulnerability." He took a step closer, not threatening but deliberate, commanding her full attention. "You're letting fear dictate your potential." Every word landed like a truth she'd been avoiding. The orders she'd turned down because they required her to work events where Marcus might appear. The website she'd never finished building because having an online presence felt too exposed. The commercial kitchen space she'd looked at but never leased because committing to growth felt like painting a target on her back. "I have a proposition for you, Miss Jackson." Antonio's dark eyes held hers, and Angela found she couldn't look away even if she'd wanted to. "One that solves both our problems." "I have a proposal." Antonio pressed the button, and the elevator hummed back to life, continuing its ascent with that smooth mechanical precision. Angela watched the floor numbers climb, 15, 16, 17, each one bringing her closer to whatever moment of decision was coming. "I'm opening a private patisserie on the hotel's roof terrace. Exclusive, invitation only. For my highest value clients and their guests." He spoke with the calm assurance of someone who'd already thought through every detail, every angle. "I need someone to run it." Angela's mind raced, tripping over the implications, the impossibility. "I deliver pastries," she said, her voice emerging steadier than she felt. "I work out of a shared commercial kitchen. I'm not a chef, I don't have formal training, I don't have..." "You're better than most chefs I've employed." Antonio cut through her spiral of inadequacy with the same certainty he'd used to dismantle Marcus. I've seen your work. Tasted your creativity. Watched you build a business from nothing while dealing with harassment that would have broken most people. The elevator reached the top floor, the penthouse level where Angela was supposed to deliver her cakes. It dinged softly, but Antonio didn't move toward the doors. The position comes with a full kitchen. Professional-grade equipment, everything you've been working toward. Your own staff, you choose them, train them, manage them. Complete creative control over the menu, the presentation, everything. It sounded too good to be true. It sounded like every dream she'd had since she was small, standing on that step stool beside her mother, learning that flour and sugar could become art. But Angela had learned that things that sounded too good to be true usually were. It also comes with living quarters if you need them. A suite on the 23rd floor, fully furnished, yours for as long as you work for me. Antonio reached into his jacket pocket and produced a card, heavy stock, cream-colored, with a single phone number embossed in gold. No name. No title. Just those numbers, gleaming like a promise or a trap. And it comes with my protection. There it was. The catch. The price. No one touches what's mine, he continued, his dark eyes holding hers with that same unwavering intensity. No one bothers my people. Marcus or anyone else who thinks they can intimidate you, threaten you, make you small, they'll have to go through me first. The offer was overwhelming. Generous beyond anything Angela could have imagined. A professional kitchen. Her own staff. Creative control. Safety. But she knew what Antonio Mancini was, what his protection meant. She'd heard the whispered stories, seen the careful way people moved around his name like it was something sharp and dangerous. She'd be entering a world of power and darkness, working for a man whose reputation made grown men nervous, whose enemies had a tendency to disappear from public life entirely. But she also knew what Marcus was. A predator who hid behind expensive suits and his father's law firm. Who made her feel crazy for being afraid. Who controlled narratives and manipulated perceptions until she couldn't trust her own reality. Marcus was danger that smiled and called it love. Why? The question emerged before she could stop it. Why help me? You don't know me. I'm just someone who delivers cakes twice a month. Antonio's expression shifted, not much, just a slight softening around his eyes that made him look almost vulnerable for half a second. Because 3 years ago, someone helped my sister leave a man who was hurting her. His voice dropped lower, carrying the weight of old guilt, old anger. I couldn't be there for her then. I was building this empire, making enemies, becoming the man people fear. By the time I found out what was happening, she'd already been suffering for months. He paused, and Angela saw something raw flicker across his carefully controlled features. But I can be here for you. And I won't apologize for how I protect what matters. The honesty stunned her. He wasn't pretending to be something he wasn't. Wasn't trying to convince her he was safe or good or anything other than exactly what he was, dangerous, powerful, and willing to use both on her behalf. He was offering her danger she could see, danger that was upfront and honest about its nature, instead of danger that disguised itself as concern and love. Angela looked down at the card in her hand, at those gold numbers gleaming under the elevator's lights. Behind her was her tiny studio apartment, her shared kitchen space, her small business that she was too afraid to grow. Behind her was Marcus, who'd proven today that he would never stop, never give up, never let her breathe freely. Behind her was a life of looking over her shoulder, of being small, of letting fear dictate her potential. In front of her was Antonio Mancini, a man whose name made people nervous. A man who just protected her with nothing more than words and the terrible weight of his reputation. A man who saw her talent and wanted to give her everything she'd been too afraid to reach for. She thought about her mother's voice. Sugar and flour can't fix everything, baby girl, but they're a good place to start. Maybe protection couldn't fix everything either. But it was a good place to start. Angela looked up, meeting those dark, penetrating eyes. When do I start? 3 months had passed since Angela had stood in that elevator, holding cake boxes and making a choice that felt like leaping off a cliff. Now, as she stood in her kitchen, with its top-of-the-line convection ovens and Italian marble counters, that leap felt less like falling and more like learning to fly. The space was a dream made real. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked the city, offering a view of Manhattan that still took her breath away when she paused long enough to notice it. Professional mixers lined one counter, their chrome surfaces gleaming under perfect lighting. Temperature-controlled storage for chocolate. A blast chiller for her experimental flavor infusions. Everything she'd ever wanted and several things she hadn't known existed until Antonio had asked what she needed and then simply made it appear. Her studio apartment on the hotel's residential 23rd floor was equally surreal, secure, beautiful, and entirely hers. No more checking the locks 3 times before bed. No more jumping at every footstep in the hallway. The building had security that made Fort Knox look casual, and everyone knew she was under Antonio Mancini's protection. It was strange how safe that made her feel, considering who he was. Her days had fallen into a rhythm that felt both challenging and natural. Creating experimental desserts for Antonio's exclusive clients, pushing her creativity to heights she'd never imagined possible. A deconstructed tiramisu with espresso caviar and mascarpone foam. A lavender honey tart with bee pollen brittle that had made a Saudi prince request her business card. A chocolate sculpture for a tech billionaire's birthday that had taken 3 days to construct and had been photographed for a dozen social media accounts. Antonio visited her kitchen daily. At first, it had been strictly business, tasting new creations, discussing the menu for upcoming events, providing feedback from clients. But somewhere along the way, those visits had shifted. Extended. Become about more than just desserts. She'd learned about him in pieces, like assembling a mosaic one tile at a time. His family had immigrated from Sicily when he was 12, his father determined to build a better life away from the violence that had consumed their village. Antonio had watched his father work himself into an early grave running a small restaurant, had learned that hard work alone wasn't enough in a world where power mattered more than principles. So he built power instead. Protected his neighborhood. Expanded his influence until his name alone could stop threats before they materialized. "My sister Sophia is getting married next month," he mentioned one afternoon, leaning against her counter while she piped delicate rosettes onto miniature pavlovas. "She wants you to make the cake." The casual way he'd said it, like inviting her into his family's most intimate celebration, was the most natural thing in the world, had made Angela's hands pause mid-squeeze. "She doesn't even know me," Angela had said. "She knows you matter to me." Antonio's dark eyes had held hers with that same intensity, but softer now, familiar. That's enough. He'd learned about her too, in those extended kitchen visits that stretched past midnight. About her mother's recipes passed down through 3 generations of women who'd turned sugar and flour into love. About her dream of opening something entirely her own someday, not just a kitchen in someone else's hotel, but a place with her name on the door, her vision in every detail. About her fear that she'd never feel safe enough to trust again, that Marcus had broken something fundamental in her ability to believe people when they said they cared. "Trust isn't binary," Antonio had said, his voice quiet in the empty kitchen. "It's not broken or whole. It's rebuilt piece by piece, with people who prove they deserve it." Tonight, after a particularly successful dinner service, 12 covers, each dessert course executed perfectly, a standing ovation from a table of Michelin-starred chefs, Antonio had appeared with a bottle of champagne. Dom Perignon, the good stuff, already chilled with 2 crystal flutes. "To your talent," he'd toasted, those dark eyes warm with genuine pride. They talked until 2 in the morning, sitting on the floor of her kitchen because the stools felt too formal, too distant. He told her about the Castellano deal, not the business details, but how it had felt to outmaneuver men who thought him too young, too immigrant, too other to play in their world. She told him about the day she'd left Marcus, how her hands had shaken so badly packing her single suitcase that she'd had to sit on the floor and breathe through the panic. "You're not shaking now," Antonio had observed, and Angela had realized he was right. She wasn't. Hadn't been in weeks, actually. The hypervigilance she'd carried for months, that constant awareness of exits and sight lines, that compulsion to check over her shoulder, had eased so gradually she hadn't noticed its absence until this moment. She hadn't had nightmares about Marcus finding her in over a month. Hadn't jumped at sudden sounds or felt her stomach drop when men approached her in public spaces. The most dangerous man in New York City had become her safest place. Antonio was watching her with that penetrating gaze, and Angela wondered if he could see the shift in her expression, the recognition of what had changed between them. This wasn't just gratitude anymore. Wasn't just relief at being protected or excitement about professional opportunity. Somewhere between the daily visits and midnight conversations, between learning his history and sharing her fears, something had shifted. "What?" Antonio asked, his voice soft in the quiet kitchen. Angela met his eyes, those dark depths that had once terrified her, and now felt like coming home. "Nothing," she said, but they both knew it was a lie. "Everything. I don't know." His lips curved into something that wasn't quite a smile, but was close. "When you figure it out," he said, standing and offering her his hand to help her up, "let me know." Their fingers touched, and Angela felt the spark of it travel up her arm, settle somewhere behind her ribs. She was in so much trouble. The dangerous kind. The kind that felt like safety and risk all at once. The best kind. 6 months after that desperate flight through a hotel lobby, Angela Mancini stood in her patisserie and watched the morning light transform sugar into diamonds. Angela's haven occupied the prime ground floor corner of the Mancini Grande Hotel, floor-to-ceiling windows offering passers-by a glimpse of magic being made. The line of customers stretched out the door, wealthy regulars mixing with curious tourists, all drawn by word of mouth that spread through the city like wildfire. She wore a custom chef's coat, cream-colored with her name embroidered in gold thread across the chest. Angela Mancini. Her real name now, the one she'd chosen. The transition from protection to love had been gradual, then sudden, like watching dawn break, where one moment it's dark and the next the world is blazing with light. Antonio had proposed at 3 a.m, after she'd made him test 15 versions of her mother's rum cake, his proposal simple and devastating. "Marry me. Build your dreams. Let me watch you shine." The wedding had been quiet, just Sophia and a handful of close friends in the hotel's rooftop garden. No spectacle, no performance, just two people choosing each other with clear eyes and open hearts. The surprise had come after, when Antonio had revealed he'd been renovating this space for months. "Not a gift to keep you close," he'd said, dark eyes holding hers, "but because I believe in your vision. This is yours, Angela. Build it however you want. Mrs. Mancini." Her assistant Maria's whisper cut through her reverie. "The food critic from the Times is here. Table 7. Angela's heart kicked once, hard, but her hands stayed steady as she checked her mise en place. She felt the weight of her wedding ring, that simple platinum band that meant safety and choice in home. Through the front window, she saw Antonio enter, 2 coffee cups in hand, his presence commanding even in the morning crowd. He met her eyes across the room, and something warm unfurled in her chest. He made his way to her, pressed a kiss to her temple that felt like a promise kept. "You've got this, Angela," he murmured against her hair. "Show them what you showed me." Angela presented her tasting menu with steady hands, each plate a story, each flavor a memory transformed. Her mother's rum cake, elevated with vanilla bean and caramelized pineapple. Lavender honey tart with bee pollen brittle, the recipe she'd perfected in that elevator pitch of a kitchen upstairs. Chocolate sculpture with espresso caviar, because sometimes art needed to be temporary and perfect and brave. As she worked, she reflected on the strange path that had brought her here. She'd run into that elevator seeking escape, not knowing she was running toward the man who would help her build a life instead of just survive one. Marcus was a distant memory now, last heard working in Seattle, far from New York and the Mancini reach. Not dramatically gone, just irrelevant. The terror that had defined her for months had been replaced by purpose, passion, and a love she never thought she deserved. Antonio watched from a corner table, dangerous and devoted in equal measure, his dark eyes tracking her movements with the same intensity he'd shown that first day. But now she knew what that intensity meant: not threat but protection. Not possession, but partnership. Angela caught his gaze across the room and smiled. She'd built exactly the life she wanted, just not in the way she'd expected. Sometimes the most dangerous choice turned out to be the safest one. Sometimes running toward danger meant running home. She was finally, truly safe. And more than that, she was free. If stories like this are your kind of escape, you're in the right place. Subscribe for more beautiful storytelling, and share this with someone who would appreciate it. And let me know in the comments. If you were Angela, would you take the chance?